In the journey of discovery about the myofascial meridians, I began to think about it as a game, and I called the game The Anatomy Trains, because there's certain things about trains that gives us insight as to how this game works. The first thing is that the tracks of myofascial pull through the body, just like train tracks, need to go pretty much in the same direction. You can't make radical changes of direction and still have a line of pull that goes through the body. So rule number one is, of an anatomy train, you can't make radical changes of direction. You have to keep going in the same direction. Secondly, you can't have one set of tracks crossing right over another set of tracks, or the trains would collide. So you can't, in the same way as if you have a line of pull going through the body, if it meets another fascial plane going opposite to it, you can't have a line of pull through that plane. So that's the second rule. You can't have one plane of fascia crossing through the other plane and still have the line of pull. Another rule of the anatomy trains game, it's actually not so much of a rule but just a condition of the fascia, is that the fascial planes or fascial lines of pull are able to divide, kind of like a Y or kind of like this switch here, so that one fascial plane can divide into two and create two separate lines of pull, and conversely two separate lines of fascia can come together and blend into one fascial plane. We'll see that a number of times throughout the body. Another way in which this train image is helpful to us is thinking about tracks and stations. The tracks are like the myofascia. They run continuously through the body. But the muscles go from station to station, from origin to insertion. And we've been thinking of muscles of just going from the origin to the insertion, and as if that was the only line of pull. But once you start thinking about the myofascial meridians, the myofascial continuities, those are just stations along this continuous track that runs right through the body. So we'll be talking about this in terms of where the tracks run and where are the stations on the tracks. So that's another rule, and I guess the last thing that we find here is that we have expresses and locals. Just like the subway in Boston, the express train covers several stations before it stops, and the locals just go from station to station. Let's go back to the classroom and I'll explain to you what I mean about expresses and locals. Okay, so one last way in which this train metaphor is useful to us, but we need the skeleton to explain it, is the idea of expresses and locals. You know, the express train only stops at the major stops and the locals stop at every stop along the way. So looking at just an example in the body, if you take the biceps muscle, for example, and you look at how it's stretched, if you figure out how many joints it's crossing, it crosses 3 joints. Do you know how to do that? Figure out how many joints it's crossing? You let your fingers do the walking. So if I start here at the coracoid process and I walk around, I walk onto the humerus, and I walk down to the ulna, and then I walk across to the radius. So it's crossing the shoulder joint, the elbow joint, and the radioulnar joint. So that means that it has 3 actions. It kind of flexes and adducts the humerus, and it flexes the elbow, and it supinates the hand, the radioulnar joint, like that. So if we look underneath it, if we look underneath the biceps, what we're going to find is a series of locals that cover the same territory, singling out each action. So if you look here, from the coracoid process down to the arm, you have the coracobrachialis muscle, which adducts and flexes the arm. And then, taking right off from that, look in your anatomy books, is the brachialis, which comes down here to the ulna, and then from the ulna over to the radius you have the supinator. So the supinator is doing the supinating, the brachialis is doing the flexing of the elbow, coracobrachialis is flexing and adducting the arm, and as you can see, the express goes, the express that covers many joints is on the outside. The locals, which cover the individual joint, are deeper on the inside. We'll see a few exceptions to that in the lower arm and lower leg, but generally that's the pattern across the body. The express is more superficial, the locals are deeper. Okay, so that's the rules of the game, and so now let's go look at a route map of the train lines in general, and then we'll take the anatomy of each line on in succession.